Under the crystal chandeliers of the banquet hall, where we had gathered to honor my daughter Isabella, Colin raised his glass of champagne and declared, "I've decided to start a new life without you." The clinking of silverware froze in midair. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting for the breakdown, the shouting, the dramatic scene everyone expected. Instead, I smiled. I am Scarlett Hayes, and shock is something I have learned to wear like a tailored dress. This time, I was ready. I placed a cream-colored envelope beside Colin's plate and said softly, "Something for you to read later." Then I turned to Isabella, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "Tonight still belongs to you." At the far end of the table, Juliana Brooks shifted uncomfortably, her confidence cracking under the weight of so many stares. To my left, Celeste Hayes, Colin's younger sister, shot him a look filled with silent disappointment. No one in that glittering hall realized that inside the envelope was not just paper. It was the first domino in a chain I had spent months setting up. Colin thought he was delivering the grand finale of our marriage. In truth, he had just walked into the opening act of mine. Before the story continues, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. I am Scarlett Hayes, the quiet engineer of a life that never seemed as steady as it appeared from the outside. While Colin bounced from one dream to the next, I was the one who kept us anchored. In the beginning, I wanted to believe in him. He had a magnetic charm, the kind that filled rooms and drew people in. He promised me a future that would shine brighter than Charleston's harbor lights. But dreams cost money, and every time one of his ventures failed, it was me who picked up the pieces. Colin tried everything. He launched a boutique yacht brokerage, then pivoted into artisanal furniture, then dabbled in high-end cocktail classes. Each venture glittered with promise, then collapsed under its own weight, and each collapse meant unpaid bills, borrowed money, and my long nights calculating how to keep us solvent. I built a career at Harborstone Industries, working my way up to CFO. By day, I managed millions in corporate budgets. By night, I balanced our household books, stretching every dollar to cover Isabella's education fund and keep our retirement savings on track. Colin spoke of passion. I delivered stability. Isabella noticed. She once told me, "Mom, you're like the lighthouse on the pier. Even when the storm hits, you never move." I smiled, but inside, her words cut deep. Even lighthouses erode eventually. It started with transfers, small, quiet, almost invisible. But after 20 years of reviewing financial statements, anomalies spoke to me like whispers in the dark. I didn't confront him. I documented. Screenshots, bank statements, receipts folded carefully and stored in a locked drawer. The pattern came together quickly. Luxury dinners charged on nights he swore he was working late. Boutique hotel bookings in our own city. A pearl bracelet purchased from King Street but never gifted to me. Then I learned about her, Juliana Brooks. Juliana wasn't a stranger. She had attended our Christmas parties, sipped wine in our living room, even once asked me for advice about navigating her career. I had thought of her as a harmless acquaintance, but the receipts told a different story. Weekend trips, whispered plans, even showings for beachfront homes at Isle of Palms. Colin had been laying the groundwork for a new life, all while telling me we needed to tighten our belts. I spent nights staring at the ceiling fan, wondering when my husband became a stranger. Anger might have consumed me, but instead, I found clarity. I had kept our family afloat for nearly 3 decades. If he thought I would crumble, he underestimated me. Quietly, I began to prepare. I met with attorneys. I reviewed the prenuptial agreement Colin had once insisted on signing. Buried within it was his downfall. A fidelity and full disclosure clause that would remain binding for the duration of the marriage. He had pushed for that clause decades ago, smug in his certainty that it would never matter. I gathered everything, every transfer, every receipt, every incriminating text message. One message still burns in my mind. After Isabella's banquet, I'll make the announcement. Public setting is better. Scarlett won't make a scene. He was right, in a way. I didn't make a scene. I built a case. For Isabella's sake, I wore the mask. I let her finish her semester free from scandal. She thought her father was distracted, tired, maybe overwhelmed. She didn't know I was assembling an arsenal of evidence in silence. Each morning, I left for Harborstone Industries, where colleagues admired my composure. Each evening, I returned home to a husband who kissed me absent-mindedly before vanishing into phone calls. He didn't notice the way I watched him, memorized his every careless mistake. By the time Isabella's banquet arrived, I was living 2 lives. In one, I was the dutiful wife and mother. In the other, I was a strategist, ready to pull the pin on everything Colin thought he controlled. When he raised his glass that night and announced his new life, he believed he had cornered me. He didn't realize the cream-colored envelope by his plate was the first domino in a carefully planned collapse. Colin thought my strength was in holding the family together. But real strength lies in knowing when to let go, and in building your lifeboat long before the ship sinks. The day after Colin's grand announcement, I woke up not as a wife betrayed, but as a woman free. Freedom doesn't always arrive in fireworks. It often comes quietly, in the calm of an early Charleston morning when the streets are still damp from ocean mist. I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and opened my laptop. My inbox overflowed with messages, some from friends at the banquet, some from colleagues at Harborstone Industries, some from people who simply wanted gossip. I ignored them all. Instead, I opened the folder I had built over months: bank transfers, receipts, screenshots, recordings. The evidence that told a story more powerful than any words Colin could spin. By noon, my attorney had filed the petition. The accounts were frozen. The house was secured in my name under the prenuptial agreement. Colin's empire of illusions had begun to collapse, but mine, my real life, was just beginning to rise. For the first time in years, I felt light. My phone buzzed with texts from Isabella. She was hurt, confused, angry at her father, but she still managed to write, "I'm proud of you, Mom. You didn't let him destroy you." That message became a lifeline. I realized then that my success wasn't just about survival. It was about creating something lasting. For myself, for my daughter, and maybe for women who didn't yet know how strong they could be. At Harborstone Industries, I was respected, even admired. But corporate work had always left me restless. I managed millions for executives who barely remembered my name. I wanted more than to be the quiet accountant of other people's fortunes. I wanted to use my expertise to protect women like me, women blindsided by betrayal, women suddenly forced to navigate finances alone. So I leased a small office near Charleston's Battery, just a few blocks from the harbor. The space was modest. White walls, scuffed hardwood floors, sunlight that poured in every afternoon, but it felt like mine. I named it Harbor and Hearth Finance. Harbor for protection, hearth for home. Two things every woman deserves when her world begins to break apart. My first clients came through quiet referrals. A friend of Celeste's was divorcing a husband who had drained their savings into reckless ventures. Another woman, a widow in her 40s, needed help untangling the investments her late husband had hidden. They came to me broken, ashamed, fearful, and left with spreadsheets, plans, and hope. Each story reminded me of my own, and each victory felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving Colin's betrayal. I was transforming it into purpose. Colin, meanwhile, was struggling. The accounts were locked. The beachfront property fell through. Juliana Brooks had less patience for financial reality than she did for champagne flutes and sunset dinners. Within weeks, she began to fade from his life, her calls less frequent, her presence less steady. Isabella, watching it all unfold, told me one evening, "Mom, you're showing me that endings can actually be beginnings." Her words settled into me like truth, because that's what this was. Not an ending, not even revenge, though revenge was sweet in its own way. This was a rebirth. I was no longer Scarlett Hayes, the quiet CFO patching up her husband's failures. I was Scarlett Hayes, founder, advisor, mentor. A woman who had turned betrayal into the cornerstone of something unshakable. The banquet may have been Colin's attempt to humiliate me, but it became the stage for my transformation, and that, I realized, was the best success of all. Not just surviving the fire, but walking out of it brighter than before. 3 days after the accounts were frozen, my doorbell rang. I had just finished a meeting at my new office, Harbor and Hearth Finance, where sunlight streamed across binders of neatly labeled cases. The women I was helping were at the beginning of their own storms, and guiding them through felt like a calling. I returned home to the Hayes residence in Charleston's historic quarter, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and listened to the cicadas hum. Then came the knock, sharp, insistent. When I opened the door, Colin stood there, his tie loosened, his face drawn. Behind him, on the sidewalk, Juliana Brooks clutched her purse. Her body angled as if ready to retreat. "Scarlett, we need to talk," Colin said. His voice no longer carried the booming confidence of a man in control. It was thin, frayed at the edges. "I think the court date is when you'll have that chance," I replied calmly. Juliana stepped forward. "Please, Scarlett, this has gone too far. Colin needs access to his funds. You're being unreasonable." I tilted my head, studying her. "Unreasonable?" The word tasted bitter. "While he siphoned money into secret accounts? While he promised you a beachfront life with money that wasn't his to give?" Juliana flushed, her composure cracking. Colin shot her a warning glance, but it was too late. The cracks between them were visible. "You can't just cut me out," Colin snapped, his tone shifting from pleading to aggressive. "We built this life together." "No, Colin," I said, voice steady. "I built it. You played at dreams, and when those collapsed, I kept us afloat. You wanted a new life, and now you have it. Without the house, without the money you stole, without the illusion you worked so hard to sell." For a moment, the silence between us was heavy. Then Isabella appeared in the doorway behind me. She had been upstairs, reading for her new job, but her voice was clear and sharp. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Colin turned, startled, as if he hadn't expected his daughter to confront him. Isabella, sweetheart, this isn't your concern. It's between me and your mother. No, she said firmly. You made it my concern when you blew up our family on my big night. You don't get to decide where the line is now. Juliana's eyes flicked between them nervously. Maybe we should go, Colin. This isn't helping. But Colin wasn't ready to leave. He stepped inside, ignoring the boundaries of a house that was no longer his. Scarlett, unfreeze the accounts. Let's be adults about this. We don't have to tear everything apart. I folded my arms. Everything was torn apart the moment you chose betrayal. And the accounts? They'll stay frozen until the judge decides otherwise. Juliana's composure broke. You never told me about those other accounts, Colin. How much money is there? How much did you hide from me, too? His face drained of color. Juliana, this isn't the time. Oh, it's exactly the time, I interrupted. Welcome to reality, Juliana. He promised you the world. But he couldn't even keep his own house in order. Isabella stepped closer, her eyes blazing. Dad, you taught me to always keep promises. You looked me in the eye that morning, told me how proud you were. And hours later, you humiliated Mom in front of everyone. Do you know how it felt to hear my friends whisper that my father left my mother during my celebration? Do you know how hard it was to keep standing there, smiling, pretending I wasn't broken? Her words cut deeper than anything I could have said. Colin's shoulders slumped. Isabella. His voice cracked, but she shook her head. No, you don't get to use my name like that anymore. Juliana turned sharply. I'm not doing this, she muttered, walking back toward her car. Call me when you figure yourself out. The slam of her car door echoed down the street. Colin stood frozen in my entryway, abandoned by the woman he had gambled everything on. I almost pitied him, almost. Scarlett, he said at last, his tone shifting to desperation. Don't do this. We can fix it. 28 years together has to mean something. I looked at him, the man I had once loved, the man I had once trusted with every part of me. For a moment, memories flickered. The early mornings when he brought me coffee, the weekends we spent walking by the harbor, the laughter we once shared. But those memories were ashes now. It did mean something, I said softly. Until you chose to burn it down. He flinched as though struck. Celeste knows, I added. Your sister. She saw you and Juliana last Christmas, and she confronted you. You lied to her, Colin. You told her it was nothing, but when she realized it wasn't, she came to me. Even your own sister couldn't stand by your choices. Colin's expression shifted from shock to despair. Everyone's against me, he muttered. Ironic, isn't it? I replied. That's exactly how you left me, alone, in front of a room full of people. I picked up the overnight bag I had packed earlier. You have until tomorrow to remove your things. After that, the locks will be changed. Don't come back without a lawyer. For the first time, Colin looked truly small. His shoulders hunched. His gaze darted like a cornered animal. What about Isabella? Think about how this affects her. Don't you dare! I snapped, anger finally piercing my calm. You weren't thinking of her when you wrote Juliana about your fresh start. You weren't thinking of her when you made your grand speech. Don't pretend to care now. Isabella stood beside me, her chin lifted, her resolve firm. Go, Dad, she said. And so he did. Slowly, reluctantly, his steps heavy, as if each one dragged another piece of his illusion away. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Isabella. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear. I wrapped her in my arms. "We're going to be okay," I whispered. "Better than okay." And for the first time in years, I believed it. When Colin left that night, the echo of the door closing felt like the final note of a symphony I had been conducting for months. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a longer battle, one where every move would be scrutinized, every slip magnified. I had to test the strength of the foundation I had built, to see if the case I had assembled could withstand the storm that was surely coming. The first test came sooner than expected. At dawn the next morning, I received an alert from my attorney. Colin had tried to move funds from a brokerage account into his personal checking. Because of the emergency filing, the transaction had been flagged and frozen. His attempt not only failed, but left a digital trail that confirmed my suspicions. He was desperate, and desperation makes people careless. I saved the notification, forwarding it to my legal team. One more brick in the wall. At Harborstone Industries, I kept my composure. The boardroom could have been a world away from the chaos unfolding in my personal life, but I had learned long ago how to keep the two separate. I reviewed quarterly reports, discussed new budget proposals, and smiled through small talk, all while my phone buzzed quietly in my purse with updates from my attorney. The contrast was almost surreal. Inside the walls of Harborstone, I was the calm, respected CFO. Outside, I was a woman unraveling her husband's schemes thread by thread. By lunchtime, I had my second test. A former colleague of Colin's called me. His voice was hesitant, as though unsure if he should get involved, but he said he'd overheard Colin bragging months ago about a new life plan, funded by assets Scarlett would never even notice. I thanked him politely, heart pounding. This was more than rumor. It was corroboration. People had heard Colin plotting, and that meant more testimony if it came to court. I typed notes immediately, documenting everything. Evidence wasn't just numbers. It was words, patterns, intentions spoken aloud. That evening, Isabella sat across from me at the kitchen table. She was still wearing her work clothes, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired. "Mom," she said quietly, "Dad called me today." I braced myself. "And?" "He said you're trying to destroy him, that you've been planning this for months, keeping secrets, making him look like a villain." Her voice trembled. "He asked me to choose." My throat tightened. I had wanted to shield her from the worst of it, but Colin had dragged her straight into the crossfire. "What did you say?" She looked at me, a mix of pain and determination in her gaze. "I told him he didn't need my help making himself look like a villain. He did that on his own." Relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. I hated that my daughter was forced to see her father this way. Yet in that moment, I realized Isabella was stronger than I had imagined. She wasn't just my child anymore. She was my ally. The next test came in the form of a phone call I had been expecting. Juliana Brooks. Her voice was sharp, her composure slipping. "Scarlett, we need to talk. I don't want to get dragged into this mess." "Colin told me everything." I almost laughed. Colin, who lied as easily as he breathed, had told her everything? "What exactly did he tell you?" I asked. "That you're vindictive, that you're trying to take everything from him, that you've turned your daughter against him." "He said you forged evidence." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because I knew Colin was desperate enough to throw anything at the wall to see what stuck. Juliana, I said evenly, I don't need to forge evidence. Colin left plenty lying around himself. And if you're worried about being dragged into this, you should remember your name is on some of those receipts. Judges don't tend to look kindly on mistresses who benefit from marital assets. Her silence stretched long enough for me to hear her breathing hitch. When she finally spoke, her voice had softened. I didn't know it would come to this. Of course she hadn't. Affairs always feel like fantasies until reality crashes through the door. Juliana, let me give you some advice, I said. Step back while you still can. Colin's fight isn't yours to carry. The line went dead. I knew I had shaken her. Another test passed, but the most important test came when Celeste, Colin's younger sister, arrived at my door with a folder in her hands. She had always been private, loyal to family, but not blind to truth. That night, she sat across from me, her face pale but resolute. I didn't want to get involved, she admitted, but I saw too much, and I can't let him rewrite this story the way he's trying to. She slid the folder toward me. Inside were photos, grainy but clear enough, of Colin and Juliana together at a restaurant taken months earlier. There were also notes she had written after confronting him last Christmas, records of their conversation. Why now? I asked quietly. Because he called me too, Celeste said, her eyes flashing. He tried to make me believe you were manipulative, that you set him up. I've watched you hold this family together for years. I won't let him smear you. I felt tears sting my eyes, not of weakness, but of gratitude. For so long, I had carried this burden alone. Now, piece by piece, the truth was forming a chorus that even Colin couldn't drown out. The investigation wasn't only about proving Colin's betrayal. It was about testing my own resolve. Could I face him without rage clouding my judgment? Could I stand in a courtroom and let evidence speak louder than my pain? Each test, each confrontation, each piece of evidence forced me to steady myself, to remember that my strength lay not in fury, but in precision. Late that night, after Isabella had gone to bed and Celeste had left, I sat in the quiet of my study. The Charleston air pressed warm against the windows, cicadas buzzing in steady rhythm. I spread out everything before me: bank statements, receipts, testimony, photos. A mosaic of betrayal carefully assembled. Colin thought his speech at the banquet was the opening act of his new life. He hadn't realized it was the opening act of mine. And with every test passed, every lie unraveled, I grew more certain. This wasn't just about divorce. This was about reclaiming my narrative, proving that betrayal doesn't define the betrayed. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had organized the folder again, neat and precise, ready for the next stage. The investigation was no longer just mine. It was a story the court would soon hear, a story Colin could no longer spin to his advantage. And as I closed the folder and turned off the lamp, I whispered to myself the truth I now fully believed. The storm has started, but I am the lighthouse. And this time, I am not guiding him home. I am guiding myself into a new horizon. The strength of any case lies not in emotion, but in evidence. I had already gathered enough to wound Colin, but to finish this properly, to make sure he couldn't claw his way back with half-truths and theatrics, I needed an unshakable wall of proof. Each morning, I rose before sunrise, pouring coffee in the quiet kitchen while Isabella still slept upstairs. The cicadas had barely stopped their night song, and the streets of Charleston were just beginning to stir. I opened my laptop, logged into accounts, and reviewed the trail he had left. Colin had always believed himself clever, but arrogance leaves footprints. The first set of records came from the brokerage account. My attorney had subpoenaed statements going back 2 years. Line after line showed transfers, small at first, then larger, regular withdrawals feeding into an account Colin thought was invisible. When the documents arrived, I spread them across the dining table. The pattern was clear, siphoning money under the guise of business investments, every dollar diverted without disclosure. I highlighted each transfer in red ink, page after page, until the trail blazed like a neon sign. But paper alone wasn't enough. I needed voices, witnesses, corroboration. That's where Celeste came in. She had already given me her photos and notes, but she went further. One evening, she handed me a thumb drive. "I recorded him," she said quietly. "Last Christmas, when I confronted him, he swore you'd never find out. I thought maybe it would scare him straight. It didn't." When I played the file, Colin's voice filled the room. "It's nothing, Celeste. Just a distraction. Scarlett is too practical, too trusting. She'll never notice. I've got it under control." The arrogance, the contempt, it was damning. I added the file to my growing archive, labeling it carefully. Evidence wasn't just about truth. It was about organization, clarity, the ability to present a story the court couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Isabella's loyalty gave me strength, but I refused to let her drown in the details. She was already hurt enough. Still, she couldn't resist helping in her own way. One afternoon, she brought me her old laptop. "Dad borrowed this last year," she explained. "He used it while his was being repaired. I found some old logins he never cleared." Curious, I opened the files. Buried in the browser history were searches for how to hide assets during divorce, best states to buy property under LLC, and separating finances before leaving spouse. My breath caught. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had researched, premeditated, planned his exit down to the last detail. I copied the data, secured it in a drive, and hugged Isabella tightly. "You've just handed me gold," I whispered. The deeper I dug, the more his lies unraveled. Credit card statements revealed dinners at restaurants where reservations were under Juliana's name. Hotel check-ins showed business conferences that coincided with her travel photos posted online. I didn't even have to hire a private investigator. Colin and Juliana had documented their affair themselves, careless in the belief that I would never look. Yet the most powerful evidence came not from receipts or files, but from people. A bartender at one of the waterfront restaurants remembered Colin dining with Juliana, slipping his wedding ring into his pocket before she arrived. A leasing agent at Isle of Palms recalled showing them a property, Colin introducing Juliana as his partner. Both agreed to provide statements once subpoenaed. Piece by piece, the mosaic grew sharper. At Harborstone Industries, I maintained my facade. Numbers, meetings, strategy sessions, all routine, all stable. But behind that mask, I was building my second career as a strategist of survival. During lunch breaks, I met with my attorney. After work, I organized binders, color-coded tabs, cross-referenced documents. My office at home looked less like a living room and more like a war room. Juliana, meanwhile, began to crumble under the pressure. She called me once more, her voice thin. "I didn't know he was moving money," she confessed. "He told me it was his. He promised me security." Promises are easy, I replied. Proof is harder, and I have proof. Are you going to drag me into court? She asked, fear bleeding through her words. That depends on you, I said. If you cooperate, if you admit what you knew, then maybe you'll walk away with your dignity intact. If not, your name will be on every receipt the judge reviews. Silence followed. I knew she was weighing her vanity against her loyalty to Colin. And I also knew vanity usually wins. Late one evening, as I reviewed the final binder, Isabella curled up beside me on the couch. Mom, she asked, her voice soft. Are you doing this for revenge? I looked at her, at the young woman she was becoming, so much like me but fiercer in ways I admired. No, I said. I'm doing this for justice, for clarity, for the truth. Revenge fades, but truth, that stays. She nodded slowly. Then I'll stand with you. And so the evidence became not just my shield, but her inheritance. A lesson in strength, in dignity, in refusing to be defined by someone else's betrayal. By the end of the month, my binders were complete. 4 thick volumes, financial, digital, testimonial, personal. Each one meticulously organized, each one a nail in the coffin of Colin's illusions. My attorney marveled at the thoroughness. You've done half my work for me, he admitted. Not half, I corrected. All of it. Because this wasn't just a legal case. It was my life, my story, my chance to prove that even when betrayed, even when humiliated, a woman could rise with her head high, armed not with rage, but with facts. Colin believed strength came from control, from deception, from keeping secrets. He was wrong. Strength came from truth, from preparation, from refusing to bend. And when the day came to present that evidence, I would not tremble. The storm was gathering. Colin was scrambling. Juliana was retreating, and the walls were closing in. But I was ready. Ready not only to fight, but to win. And as I closed the final binder and stacked it neatly on the desk, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Retaliation is not rage. Rage burns fast and wild, leaving only ash behind. What I needed was something quieter, colder, and infinitely sharper. Colin thought he had humiliated me in front of a room full of people, but I would show him that real power lies not in spectacle, but in strategy. Each night, after Isabella went to bed, I sat in my study surrounded by binders, papers, and a laptop that hummed like a machine of war. I treated the work the way I once treated corporate forecasting at Harborstone Industries. Columns of possibilities, contingencies, risks, and outcomes. Where others saw chaos, I saw patterns. Where Colin saw freedom, I saw a trap waiting to be sprung. The assets were already secured under the fidelity clause of our prenuptial agreement, but Colin believed he could talk his way out of anything. I knew he was rehearsing arguments, preparing to cast me as vindictive, unstable, even manipulative. I needed more than evidence. I needed to dismantle his credibility in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Celeste became a crucial ally. She moved gracefully through Charleston's social circles, listening more than speaking, sharing just enough truth at the right moments. She didn't spread gossip. She planted facts. By the time Colin attempted to rewrite the story, whispers of his betrayal had already hardened into quiet certainties among those who once admired him. The public narrative had shifted, not in my favor by accident, but by design. At the same time, I focused on building Harbor and Hearth finance. Success itself became a form of retaliation, the kind Colin could never match. Every new client was proof that I was not broken, not abandoned, not diminished. I was thriving. Women came to me with trembling voices and broken finances, and left with plans, clarity, and hope. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon the same community Colin had counted on for support looked at me with respect. In their eyes, I had not only survived, I had risen. But I wanted him to feel the collapse of his fantasy, not just in court, but in his daily life. Juliana had been promised houses, security, a future built on sand. I quietly reached out to the leasing office at Isle of Palms, where Colin had tried to secure a property. The agent confirmed the application had failed because of financial verification. I ensured they had court documents showing the frozen accounts. If Juliana thought she had a seaside escape waiting, she was about to discover her castle was built on air. Still, the most delicate part of retaliation was dealing with Juliana directly. I arranged to meet her at a cafe near the harbor, choosing neutral ground where the sound of waves would soften the sting of truth. She arrived late, her eyes shielded by sunglasses, her posture defensive. "You wanted to see me," she said. "Yes," I replied evenly. "To give you a choice. You are implicated whether you like it or not. Your name is on receipts, your presence documented. Colin has painted you as his partner in more ways than one. If you testify honestly, if you admit he promised you assets that were never his to give, you might leave this with some dignity. If not, you will face discovery right beside him." Her cup rattled slightly against the saucer as she picked it up. "I didn't know he'd go this far," she whispered. "You knew enough," I said gently, though my words were sharp. "And you can still choose whether to sink with him or step away." She left without agreeing, but I had seen the fear in her eyes. Fear was enough. Hesitation corrodes alliances, and she would no longer be the unwavering partner Colin thought she was. Back home that evening, Isabella sat across from me, her expression serious. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Marrying him? Giving him almost 30 years? I thought of the early mornings with coffee and laughter, the weekends by the harbor, the dreams that once seemed possible. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret the life we built. I regret the way he chose to end it." Planning retaliation wasn't about erasing our past. It was about ensuring the future wasn't dictated by his betrayal. Every plan I made, every whisper I allowed to circulate, every document I organized was crafted not only to win in court, but to teach Isabella what true strength looks like. Strength is not screaming in anger. It is refusing to bend while you prepare the strike that cannot be ignored. Colin thought his loud announcement at the banquet was power. He would soon learn that true power is silent, steady, and devastating. And when his carefully built illusion collapsed, it wouldn't be because I raised my voice. It would be because I refused to let him control the story any longer. The day of the hearing arrived with a Charleston sky heavy and gray, the kind that pressed down like a storm about to break. I dressed in a navy suit, simple, tailored, unshakable. Isabella hugged me at the door before heading to work, her eyes filled with pride. "You've got this, Mom," she whispered. I carried those words with me like armor. Inside the courthouse, the air was tense. Colin sat across the aisle, flanked by a young lawyer whose nervous glances betrayed inexperience. Juliana was not at his side. She had been absent for weeks, retreating once the weight of truth became too heavy. Celeste sat behind me, a quiet pillar of strength. The judge, sharp-eyed and impatient with theatrics, called the session to order. Colin's lawyer began with bluster, claiming the prenuptial agreement was outdated, irrelevant, expired. But when my attorney presented the highlighted clause, the fidelity and financial disclosure requirement that remained valid throughout the marriage, the courtroom shifted. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. "This agreement is clear," she said firmly. "It stands." Colin's color drained. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, but the young man had no lifeline to offer. Then came the evidence. Binder after binder laid bare the transfers, the hidden accounts, the credit card charges, the browser history of how to hide assets. Each piece was introduced calmly, methodically, until the weight of proof crushed the room into silence. The recording of Colin's voice played next. "Public setting is better. Scarlett won't make a scene." His arrogance echoed through the chamber, every word a nail in his own coffin. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Hayes, these actions demonstrate not only infidelity, but deliberate financial deception. This court will enforce the agreement in full." The ruling came swiftly. The house, the retirement accounts, and the majority of joint investments would remain with me. Colin would leave with only his personal possessions and what remained in his private account, barely enough to rent an apartment. But the climax wasn't just in the ruling. It was in the gallery where members of Charleston's social circle had gathered. Curious eyes that once admired Colin now widened in disbelief. They had heard whispers, but today they saw the truth laid bare. Every lie he had spun unraveled under the cold light of evidence. When the session ended, Colin tried one last time. He caught my arm in the hallway, his voice breaking. "Scarlett, please. We don't have to do this. We can fix it. 28 years means something." I turned to him, meeting his desperate gaze. "It did mean something, until you decided it didn't." I gently pulled my arm free. His hand fell as if the weight of his choices had finally crushed him. Reporters were waiting outside. I had prepared for this moment. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, questions flew. "Mrs. Hayes, do you have a comment?" I smiled faintly, my voice calm. "This isn't a story of revenge. It's a story of truth. When trust is broken, there are consequences. That's all." I walked past them, head high, my silence louder than any spectacle. By evening, word had spread. Friends called, some apologetic, others supportive. Celeste poured us glasses of wine in her sunroom, the air scented with jasmine. "He thought he could humiliate you," she said with quiet satisfaction. Instead, he humiliated himself. Isabella joined us later, still in her work clothes, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion. "Everyone's talking about it," she said. "They finally see who he really is, and they see who you are too." I smiled, a deep, steady smile. The public climax hadn't been about tearing Colin down. It had been about showing the world that I stood, unbroken, stronger than before. As the cicadas sang outside, I realized something important. Retaliation had begun in private, but its power was magnified in the open. Not because I shouted louder, but because truth speaks for itself when given the chance. And today, the truth had spoken. The fallout came quickly, sharper than I expected. Within days of the ruling, Colin's carefully constructed image crumbled like wet paper. He moved into a modest apartment far from the historic district, a place with peeling paint and no harbor view. The man who once boasted about beachfront property now argued with landlords about deposits and utilities. Juliana vanished almost entirely. Friends whispered she had left Charleston for a new job in Atlanta, embarrassed by the role she had played in Colin's downfall. She had not been subpoenaed. My attorney and I didn't need her once the evidence stood on its own, but her absence spoke volumes. The glamorous partner he had promised the world abandoned him when the checks stopped clearing. Among our social circle, silence greeted Colin where applause once had. Invitations dried up. Old colleagues avoided his calls. Even his business faltered. Without access to the joint accounts and without my quiet hand steering finances, his ventures sputtered. He had always relied on me more than he realized, and now that truth was undeniable. For Isabella, the consequences were more personal. She told me how friends at work stopped pitying her and started admiring her resilience. "They say you're inspiring," she confessed one evening, curling up on the sofa with me. "They've seen stories about women who collapse after betrayal, but you didn't. You built something better." I hugged her tightly, knowing that of all the victories, showing my daughter the strength of survival mattered most. Celeste, too, felt the shift. At faculty gatherings, colleagues approached her quietly, praising her courage for siding with me when it mattered most. She shrugged it off, but I could see the relief in her eyes. Family loyalty had nearly trapped her, but truth had set her free as well. And then there was me. Harbor and Hearth Finance grew rapidly, fueled by word of mouth and quiet endorsements from women who knew my story. I moved from the small office to a larger suite downtown, hiring 2 associates. Clients came not only for financial guidance, but for reassurance, for proof that betrayal didn't have to define the rest of their lives. Each case I took on was another stone laid in the foundation of my new life. The consequences for Colin were heavy, but I carried none of his weight anymore. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, I was free, not just legally, but emotionally. And freedom, I discovered, is the sharpest consequence of all. 6 months later, the air in Charleston carried the scent of salt and magnolia. I stood in the office of Harbor and Hearth Finance, sunlight flooding through the tall windows, files neatly stacked on my desk. Isabella stopped by often, her laughter filling the space, her pride in me more precious than any settlement. Celeste had become a regular ally, our bond deeper than it had ever been. But life is never without shadows. One evening, as I locked up, I noticed an envelope slid beneath my office door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with scrawled handwriting I knew too well. "This isn't over." Colin's words, raw and desperate, stared back at me. For a moment, the old ache returned, the reminder that battles never end neatly. I folded the note, slipped it into a drawer, and exhaled. His threats no longer carried weight. They were echoes of a man who had already lost. Because I knew the truth. Whatever storm he tried to summon, I had already built my lighthouse. And this time, I was guiding myself toward horizons he could never touch. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories, where betrayal meets justice and survival becomes reinvention.